Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is time for MSI to start. We've done our pre-tournament coverage. You can check out my primer video that I posted yesterday up in the iCard right now. If you haven't seen that video, we power rank every single team at the tournament as well as every single player in their role at the tournament. We preview the play-ins. We do all of that in that video there, so check that out if you haven't already. But I don't want to talk too much at the beginning of this. We've got a lot to cover in today's video. What we are going to do, of course, with day number 1 here of the play-in stage is go through every single game and talk about what happened. So I'm very excited. Quick plug at the beginning of this video that I'm going to be doing for a majority of this month, or at least at the start of this month. I will be streaming over on Twitch basically every single weekend, covering the CLOL championships that are happening right now. I'm an official co-streamer for the CLOL championships, and so we will be watching a lot of the collegiate league scene here in North America live over on my Twitch channel. The link to that is going to be down in the description. Go ahead and give it a follow if you want to go watch some live content from me. But with that plug out of the way, let's get right into the content. I don't want to waste you guys' time. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in the 2 best-of-3 series that we got, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and I will be giving a player of the series at the end of each best-of-3. We will talk a bit about tomorrow's games at the end of the video, but for the most part, we are going to be talking about day number 1 here, and day 1 kicked us off with some really fun games. Group A, I think, is definitely the more competitive side of the bracket. I think it's the least, guaranteed. I think Group B definitely has 2 favorites to get out of the group, and you kind of know the order that all of the teams are going to fall in, but I think Group A has a lot more that could offer some interesting storylines, we'll just say, and I think that definitely kicked us off with our first series of MSI, our first series of day number 1 here in the play-ins, and that was the number 2 seed from the LCS in FlyQuest taking on the number 1 seed from the PCS in PSG Talon. I had these 2 teams back-to-back in my power rankings. They were in different tiers. I had FlyQuest at the bottom of C tier, and I had PSG Talon at the top of D tier, but I do think they are a lot closer than maybe one would expect on paper from a major region versus minor region matchup. I think PSG is just generally really good. This team does remind me a lot of what they were last year, and you have to go back to Worlds to kind of remember what PSG was. They threw away a golden opportunity to get into the main stage of Worlds in the play-ins last year against BDS. They really had no business losing that series against BDS. They were the better team in those 5 games, and they just couldn't quite get out of their own way in draft. And it ended up costing them their season, which was definitely a bit unfortunate, but they've rebounded well. You bring in Betty down in the bot lane. That's like your big addition in the offseason, and this team has gotten better. This team has gotten more consistent, but they're still the same team that they were last year, which is to say slow, boring in the early game, if you will, but great team fighters. This has always been the scouting report on PSG with Junjia and Maple as the mid-jungle duo. That's what Junjia really specializes in, drawing games out and being an excellent team fighter. Maple is definitely more of a secure player, not somebody that's going to be looking for all these big highlight plays. Is going to be somebody that is a lot more like, I just want to win the front to back 5v5. Like, that's the style that PSG wants to play, and FlyQuest can play that style, but it's definitely a little bit different coming from North America, where you do have a lot more skirmishing just in general as a region. I think luckily for Fly, a lot of their games do go long, and so you are prepared, I think, for PSG to slow the pacing down, and I think there are some lane advantages. You talk about Junji and Maple kind of being the core of PSG, which they absolutely are. Well, Inspired and Jensen were one of the best mid-jungle duos in North America, and I do think you have a pretty big advantage for Fly on the top side of the map with Whippo going into Aji, and so that's where I would expect FlyQuest to be able to generate their leads in a matchup like this, but I certainly don't think it's guaranteed for them to just dominate this series. As I said in my preview, there's a reason these 2 teams were back-to-back. One thing I do want to add, NA has done a really bad job at a lot of things internationally, but they've done a really good job at beating minor region teams. It's honestly the thing that the LCS does the best, is beating teams from, the PCS and the VCS and CBLOL, etc. Like, they are very consistent at taking down teams that they are just better than, and so that does give a little bit more confidence over to the side of FlyQuest, and I did predict them to win this series, but PSG is certainly not a team that's going to go down without a fight. They are very talented, very secure, and I expect this to be a fun series, but are we going to get a fun series? Are we going to get a blowout? Well, of course, we have to know going game by game, and that means starting with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was PSG Talon, they are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and remember, this is a best of 3. Game 1 is significantly more important in a best of 3 than it is in a best of 5. You don't have more chances. You don't have 2 chances to get out of this. You have 1 chance to get out of this if you are FlyQuest, and so going down in this game is definitely disappointing. There was definitely a large portion of like the mid to late game that they had full control over here for Fly, but PSG honestly never really felt like they were out of the game, and I think a lot of that just comes back to the scouting report for PSG, which is that, especially in comparison to some of these lower tier, like Western teams like, you know, FlyQuest or Liquid or Fnatic, these teams that aren't necessarily considered to be like world beaters in terms of mechanics, like their team fighting is going to be able to keep up with all of these teams. And that's kind of what we saw, is that their team fighting not only kept up with what FlyQuest was offering, but actually eclipsed it even when they were down 4K gold or whatever they were, you know, 25, 30 minutes into the game. So big credit to PSG. I thought they really played well in this one. And I know a lot of people are going to jump on FlyQuest for blowing a lead in this game, but honestly, like, some of their team fighting was fine. I think for the most part, they played okay in this game. There were a couple of pretty major mistakes in terms of getting caught out in bad positions, expecting a little bit too much from what they're able to output in a front-to-back 5v5 in a comp that, while it does do well in that circumstance, you do have things like Jinx, you do have things theoretically like Urgot that can be strong in those instances. I mean, it's Rumble, Jarvan, Azir, Senna. Like, you're never really going to be able to front-to-back in the same kind of way, and so you end up getting into these positions where you lose these pretty important fights. You're getting caught out in your own jungle, and all of a sudden the game just kind of spirals out of control. You lose one big fight, you know, at Dragon, and the game is just over, right? The game just instantly ends, and so, you know, I'm not going to criticize them too much because I do think they played well for a majority of this game, but I do think PSG played better, and I think that that should be a credit in their cap. Player of the game is going to go to Betty in the bot lane. This is an example of why Senna is going to be high priority at this tournament. Not every game is Senna going to pop off like this. Not every game is Senna going to do as much damage as Betty was able to do in game number 1 here, but this was a very good example of what happens when you can get a ridiculous amount of stacks on Senna super early on in a game. If you're able to snowball that champion quickly, I mean, she's going to delete people in teamfights. She's going to do 800 damage every 2 autos, and so, you know, it's pretty ridiculous to see what Betty was actually able to do in these fights. It wasn't just him, but I certainly think he was the biggest piece of the puzzle, if you will, for a lot of what PSG wanted to play around for the back half of the game. Credit to Junjia. I thought some of his engages on the Jarvan were really excellent. You know, I didn't know if the Jarvan buffs were actually going to matter all that much because we have things like Vi in the meta, even Xin Zhao in the meta, that I think do Jarvan's, you know, role a bit better, but Vi, Xin Zhao both banned out by FlyQuest in this game. They knew that, you know, PSG wanted to go for this more teamfight-oriented bruiser. You know, the Wukong also off the table for them, and so they pivot over to the Jarvan, who I think is a good substitute for those champions, and Junjia was really excellent, again, showing some of his proficiency in teamfights that's led him to be the best player in the PCS over the past 2 years. Maple was really good. He's got the opposite of LEC Azir syndrome, as I like to call it. For those of you who don't watch the LEC, I call it LEC Azir syndrome because if you're a European Azir player, you have to go for the Shuriman Shuffle in a teamfight or else your brain explodes. There's like a chip in your brain that detonates if you don't go for the Shuriman Shuffle. If you just front to back as Azir and do damage, you're not allowed to do that in the LEC, or at least that's what I assume with how they play. Maple had the opposite, where he never went for the Shuriman Shuffle this game, and honestly, there are times where I completely prefer this playstyle. Allow your Jarvan, allow your Tahm Kench, allow your Rumble to be more mid-lane creators, and just kind of do the damage that you're supposed to be doing on Azir. Be that late-game hyper carry that champion can be. That's going to be a positive overall for this team. You know, there was just a lot of good to talk about. I think Woody was a little bit up and down in the early game, especially with the way that they wanted to do their lane structures. The Tahm Kench wasn't always in the best spot. And then Aji, you know, he's just okay. Bwipo was clearly the better player, but was also put in a much rougher spot, I think, because of the way they wanted to do their lane structure in the early game. So for PSG, it was really good being able to weather the storm of the early game, keep things relatively close. Yes, you lost a bit of pressure in the mid to late game, but you responded well in the front-to-back 5v5s. You got the fight wins that you needed to get, and you won the game. So that's all that really matters in the end, right? And then for Fly, losing game number 1 is definitely unfortunate. Not having that pressure, having to win both of the final 2 games is definitely not ideal. It's not a perfect situation to be in at the start of this tournament, but I don't think they played miserable. I think that there were definitely some positives. I thought Masu in particular was really good on this on the Jinx in this game, was given a lot of opportunity to try and win fights for them in the late game, and I think he did his job. There just wasn't a lot of opportunity for him to outdo the Senna plus Azir when it's just the Jinx, right? It becomes a lot more difficult to be a primary carry when the enemy team has multiple options to be able to beat you with. I think Bwipo was obviously also a pretty notable player throughout a majority of this game, but I actually didn't really love the way he played the laning phase. He basically had free lane, and he spent it not getting as many resources as you would like. And so I want to see him just be a little bit greedier in terms of the way that he plays the game, maybe a bit less like punishing and a bit more like I want to get resources to play for late game, especially against a team like PSG Talon. I think that's going to be more beneficial, but Urgot was obviously still very relevant in this game. That ultimate was super crucial in multiple fights. That was a big reason why FlyQuest were able to get their big lead, was because Urgot would be initiating a lot of these fights, being able to catch somebody out with that ult and being able to shut down, make it a 4v5 at the beginning of every fight, and Masu could just take over from there. You know, good things from Inspired as well, but Jensen and Busio, I think, had some question marks. Jensen was out of position, I think, multiple times this game, and it definitely ended up costing FlyQuest just a little bit of over-aggression coming in from him on the Taliyah, and I don't think Busio played well at all here on the Nautilus. He's going to get done of the game in game number 1. I just don't think he was really all that good in this game. A lot of the hooks that he did land were at bad times, and I generally think he was actually out of position a lot. You know, when you're playing Nautilus, you're going to die for your team a lot, and so it's hard to really get an idea of whether or not he was just doing his job or whether or not he was just inting it away, but he was way too far forward, in my opinion, in a lot of these engages, and especially when you look at, you know, what he was able to do in the LCS, you have to be able to play on the edge of danger as Nautilus. You have to know when to press the go button, and I think him being a little bit too overeager in some of these circumstances actually did maybe cost FlyQuest this game, and so not a perfect game from Fly, but certainly good enough to give you hope that they can bounce back in this series, because there is an argument to be made that they should have won this game, but PSG was also really good, and they played their style. I think FlyQuest needs to speed the game up. They need to be able to play a lot more fast, and they need to punish some of these laning mistakes a bit more. If you allow a team like PSG, especially with the draft that they had, to get into the late game, they're just going to beat you there, so you can't allow them to get there. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in game number 2, but again, must win for FlyQuest. They're not out of the tournament if they lose, but you don't want to go to lower bracket in the first series as a major region. This is a big one for both of these teams. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and we are going to a game number 3 in our first best of 3. This is what we wanted to see at MSI. We wanted to see competitive series. We wanted to see back and forth games. We wanted to see every team show up, and we knew this series was going to, at the very least, be close or be within the realm of being close, and that's exactly what it's been. I think you can look at game 2 and see a much more dominant performance than game number 1, and I would agree with that. You know, game 1 was pretty back and forth. FlyQuest had a lead for a lot of the back half of that game. They just couldn't quite close it out, but this one was very clearly Fly winning every single major fight. And again, it's the players that we highlighted at the beginning of this tournament in their preview that have really stepped up and been amazing. They still have some problems. They still have some players that I don't think are playing, you know, up to their peak form, at least so far in this series, but this was a much better example of, I think, what FlyQuest does well, rather than game number 1, where it just kind of felt like they were on the back foot in terms of decision making for the entirety of the game, essentially. And then for PSG, just not nearly as competent in terms of the team fighting stage of this game. You actually did a good job of being able to try and establish pressure in the early game, which we will continue to talk about. I think the Kalista Ashe bot lane adds to that. It just adds a different dynamic than something like Senna Tahm Kench does, but we saw kind of the negative of that as well as we transitioned further and further into the late game. You got the gold on the wrong player in the early game here, and it ended up being a lot more difficult for you to take those 5v5s that you honestly should be excelling at as a team. I think it took away some of that advantage when you did draft the Kalista, and so, you know, we'll get to that. We'll go through it when we get to PSG, but let's talk about FlyQuest first. Player of the game is going to go to Bwipo. His team fighting was unbelievably good this game. He's going to get a lot of praise for this game number 2, and rightfully so. He was definitely the carry, and Urgot looks ridiculous for Bwipo right now. This is not a champion that I would expect to see often at this tournament. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it will continue to be a high priority pick, but I would more so expect this to be like, oh, Bwipo really likes Urgot, and he's going to pick Urgot in these situations, but we certainly saw the strengths of this champion in game number 2 here. We saw it in game 1 as well, but being able to get that immediate like fear off in a fight, if you're able to get anybody low, if you're able to get an AoE fear off quickly into a fight, it just opens up more opportunities for even the Lucian to do a lot more damage and a lot more action in these fights, for the entire team to position a bit more aggressively when it comes to this 5v5. Adding on top of that, he can genuinely play as a pseudo tank because Sterix is just really good on him, and it gives him so much extra health, as we saw in so many of these fights. And so we saw PSG trying to burst down the Urgot early to not allow him to start to take over, but they just didn't have the damage to actually break through the sheer amount of health that he was having over the course of the fight. And then there's a ridiculous amount of lockdown elsewhere on this team to kind of, you know, follow up on whatever that Bwipo wanted to do in some of these fights. So credit to him, he was really good, but I do want to say, Inspired is going to go super under the radar for how good he was in this game. Maokai's not a flashy champion. He's not someone that you're going to look at and say, wow, the Maokai took over, especially because it was a bit slower from him. In the early game, Junji, I think, actually was more active in terms of the first 10 minutes of the game, where you're typically looking for a lot of jungler advantages, but Inspired's teamfighting was almost perfect in this game, and his mid-game control was super good. A big reason why Fly was able to really, calm the storm in the early game when mid lane was really being taken advantage of is because I think Inspired played so well in the mid-game. So Bwipo, Inspired, I think, having a great game number 2. They were the players to highlight going into MSI, and it's really good to see those are the 2 players that are continuing to step up here. I will say, some concerns elsewhere. I thought Busia was much better here in game 2. That's not the concern. Masu, I think, did his best with the situation that he was given. Sometimes he was a bit too far forward, but again, that was kind of the point of why you wanted to draft a Lucian and why you wanted to play a Lucian in this particular instance, but Jensen continues to struggle a bit. I know his scoreline doesn't actually look all that bad, but got caught out a couple of times in the early game. You know, the second one, the Ash Arrow, definitely not entirely his fault, but probably should be at the very least a little bit more respectful for that, but some of his positioning in teamfights was bad. I mean, the Weaver's walls were good. Typically, the ultimates were on point. They were well communicated, and you know, they did a lot for the macro of the team, but he just wasn't doing any damage. And on a champion like Talia, where I really do think she's the strongest thing that is consistently going to get through draft in the meta right now, it just didn't feel great from Jensen. And I think if he's going to be a little bit out of form, that's going to be a bit more concerning when you potentially, you know, go into stronger teams later down in the tournament. But obviously, they're not out of this series yet. It was just a good game to win. But for PSG on the other side, just didn't have the same kind of pressure that they had in game number 1. When you talk about being able to survive the early game, they still did a good job of that, and in fact, they were more proactive in the early game. Woody was very good. Junjia was definitely out there trying to make plays, but like I said earlier, the gold just went onto the wrong target. Ashe was the one with all the gold in this game, and that's just really not a good situation for you to be in. You can play around Ashe, and you can play around her ability to set up for the rest of the team, but, you know, Betty not having any sort of way to scale into the late game where he is best as a player is a problem. Junjia not really having any sort of way to survive some of these fights as soon as the Urgot got fed is a bit of a problem, and most notably, Maple just had a really bad game here. In game 2, not only was he not gaining a lot of resources, but some of that lack of aggression really came back to bite him in this game, where it just didn't feel like this team was making enough plays. So overall for PSG, I'm not going to sit here and criticize them too much, but they got away from what they're good at. I know you still have that Sedge Azir combo, which is going to be consistent. Cassante, I think, is good for this team overall, but you got to go back to a scaling bot lane as well. That clearly feels like what PSG is just most comfortable playing. If you put yourself in a position where you have to be priority in the early game with your bot lane, then it's just not playing to the strengths of what Betty is as a player. We saw what he could do on Senna. I'd love to see him back on another hyper carry or something that is going to be more consistent in the teamfight stage as well. For FlyQuest, obviously big win to keep this series alive, but you got to be able to translate that. Bwipo and Inspired were great, but Jensen simply has to be better as this series comes to a close here in the final game. Busio and Masu, I think, stepped up. It's all going to be about which team makes the least amount of mistakes, in my opinion, between these two playstyles, and that's all going to come down to game 3. So, who's going to be moving on to the winners part of this, and who's going to be heading down to the lower bracket after their first series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to win this series 2-1. They're moving on to the winners finals, I guess, of Group A here for an opportunity to get out of the group as the number 1 seed, which obviously would be a pretty big achievement. It doesn't get easier from here, but it's good to see this team take, you know, kind of a rough series. I wouldn't say rough series, but a more back and forth series and look a bit more dominant, especially towards the back half of game number 3 here. Things were close for a lot of this game up until about 25 minutes into the game, but when you look at these big 5v5s, PSG just didn't have the same kind of fighting potential as what FlyQuest had in this game. I think you had the best players on the Rift on Fly's side, and you had the worst players on the Rift on PSG's side, or at least the worst player on the Rift, which we will talk about. There was one player who did not show up today in this series, really at all, for PSG, and, you know, it's going to be a conversation, but this is a really nice win for Fly. Player of the game in Game 3 is going to go to Jensen for me. I think you could very realistically give this to either of the carry duo here for Fly, either Jensen or Masu, who I think both played very well. I think Jensen had to do a bit more in this game, especially in the back half. Obviously, the quadro to close out the game was very, very big. That fight did not go as expected for FlyQuest. It should have been a lot cleaner, but some problems, some mistakes, I would say, in that fight ended up meaning that they had to rely on Jensen's Orianna to win the game, but he was really good throughout a majority of it. The shockwaves were always on point. Basically, all of them were consequential as we got into a lot of these team fights, and he really only made one, I guess, mistake, and that was getting caught out in a side lane once in this game. Outside of that, he was basically perfect. He is the one who ended the game, and so Jensen, for me, is going to get player of the game. He wasn't perfect throughout the beginning of this series. I talked about how games 1 and 2 weren't exactly ideal, but he gets off the Talia, a champion that he's good at, but not like, it's not one of his premier picks, I guess you could say, and he gets an Orianna, the champion that he is by far the most well known for. This is his 100th game on Orianna, and he gets a win at an international tournament with it. It's a good storyline, but player of the series overall for me is going to go to Bwipo. The Olaf wasn't quite as consequential as the Urgot was in the first couple of games, but with Urgot banned, Bwipo is still going to try and play aggro, especially into someone like Aji, who I think he just feels like he should be better than, and he was throughout a majority of this series. We'll talk about Aji in a second. He had his best game of the series by far here in game number 3, where the Cassante was probably the most relevant member of PSG. In a lot of these late fights, the Cassante and the Rel, I think, were the combo duo, if you will, but Bwipo was still really good throughout this series. He was great in game 1, even in their loss. He was really setting up a lot of team fights there, and he was the dominant carry in game number 2, so I understand giving him player of the series, and that's what I will do. But big shout out to Inspired, who was really, really quietly fantastic in this series, especially in that second game, but he was still very good on the Sedge here. Wish he was a little bit more clinical with some of those ultimates. Some of them went a bit wide, or at least wider than you would have wanted, but he was still very good in this game. Masu was excellent in his international debut. People forget this guy's only been playing competitive, not like professional, but competitive League of Legends at any level for 4 splits. He's been, he was an amateur for 1 split, he was in the NACL for 2 splits, and he's been in the LCS for 1 split. And so to see him succeeding already against, the best team in the PCS, it's really, really encouraging. And he had some great positioning moments in some of these fights. PSG made it a priority to try to take him down in a lot of these early skirmishes, and, he was definitely a priority for just kind of the action of a lot of this game, even in the early game down in the bot lane, and so they clearly respect him a lot. He is a very talented player, and he definitely showed up here in his first international game. I hope that form can continue. If there is a concern, Busio was not particularly great in this series. Some of the hooks on Nautilus just weren't there. I think he by far had his best game on the Nami in game number 2. Nautilus has never really been one of those champions that he has like excelled on. He's known for his Rakan. I would imagine that could be something that they could continue to go to. I don't really see any reason not to prioritize Rakan for this team. He does a lot of what they want their support to do, and it's Busio's best champion, but, it was good enough. Like, Busio wasn't, like, game losing. He just made some mistakes. That hook in the final Elder fight was almost disastrous, but it wasn't quite disastrous enough to lose them the game. But Jensen, very good. Masu, Inspired, Bwipo, all very solid here, and FlyQuest is going to be moving on to winners finals. And then for PSG, they just had a couple of mistakes here. Maple was really bad in this series, and I can't exactly explain why that was the case, because he was good for a majority of this year. He was really good last year. This isn't a player that I think you would have expected to be past his prime going into this tournament. Maybe he's not like prime Maple, like 2017 Maple, but he's still a very good player. He just got completely outclassed in this series. I mean, Jensen wasn't great in the first 2 games, but Maple really didn't do anything at all in game number 2, was relied a lot for the damage on Azir in that second game and didn't do much. And then he was just useless in this game on the Karma. He basically accomplished nothing, was going down first in a majority of these fights. Just not a particularly proficient series from Maple, and they're going to need him to be better. We talked about the jungle mid duo being the most important part of this team, at least domestically, going into this tournament, and I continue to believe that's the case. If Maple's going to play like this, it's not going to go well. Junjia also played his worst game of the series on the Xin Zhao here. I think he was just way too passive in some of these late fights. One of the things I really admire about Junjia is that he's willing to go out there and try to make plays to try to set up the rest of his team, but there were a lot of moments here where he was just flashing out, staying on the edge of danger, hoping his teammates don't run it down. I really want to see him in the middle of the action and actually trying to create, things here, because there are mistakes to be taken advantage of on the side of FlyQuest, but jungle mid just wasn't good enough. I don't think Betty's positioning in the back half of this game was good either, but Kalista falls off just in general. Hate the Kalista pick for this team. I don't think it plays towards their strengths at all, but Aji and Woody were fine. I think Woody arguably maybe had his best game of the series here, maybe outside of the Tom Kench, but one of his better games of the series here in game number 3. I thought some of those rel engages were really good, and he was unkillable by the end of the game, and Aji definitely had his best game of the series in game number 3 here, where the Cassante was really their only hope to win any of these fights. It just wasn't enough, right? Jensen, Masu, and Inspired in particular, really, in this game number 3 just had way too many resources, and so PSG now moves down to the lower bracket. They, of course, take on the loser of the series we will talk about next. FlyQuest takes on the winner. Neither of these teams are eliminated. Both have the opportunity to potentially run into each other again, depending on how this tournament ends up going, but FlyQuest definitely going to feel good walking away with a win in this one. But then moving on now to our second series that we covered here on day number 1, the other side of Group A. This one definitely not as close on paper, but you never know what can happen. It's League of Legends. No game is ever done before it started. It's the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1, taking on the number 1 seed from the LLA, and Estral Esports. And I believe it is Estral, like Estral. Again, if I'm wrong about that, correct me down in the comments. Medic pronounced it about 45 different ways on the broadcast, and so just let me know which one is correct. If there are any LLA fans watching this, would love to get that correct. Same thing with Snacker. Apparently it's Snacker in the bot lane. We will talk about that and not Snaker. Why isn't there a C after the A if it's Snacker? I'm never going to understand, but let's actually talk about the analysis of this series. I mean, there really isn't a lot to preview here. If T1 plays even remotely up to their standard, this is going to be the biggest blowout of the entire tournament. Very likely here you have, at minimum, a top 4 team at this tournament taking on maybe the worst team at this tournament, and so you're not really expecting this to be as close as Fly PSG was, because I do think both of those teams do have selling points going for them, but there are some interesting matchups that I think are at least worth talking about. I think Ackerman and Cody have been kind of the stars for Estral over the course of this year. Ackerman, I think, was a lot more aggro than I was expecting, and he was definitely somebody this team relied upon to create in the mid game for them, and Carey is obviously known for his ability to go out there and create. I really like this support matchup to highlight because I do think it is 2 players that the teams do invest a lot into, trying to get further ahead, I'll say. And the bot laners for both of these teams kind of are similar in that same vein, where Guma is often going to be put on an island to allow Carey to be a bit more of a playmaker, and Snacker is also going to be put on a bit more of an island. Now, that's not always going to be the case. Snacker actually does play strong side every once in a while. Like, it's not like Guma Yushi where they just don't pick things that need a lot of resources down in the bot lane, because it's just not how T1 wants to play. Snacker can pick, Callista. Snacker can pick some of these more early game, quote-unquote, ADCs that are going to be a bit more lane dominant or lane dependent. You're just not going to see it as often, in my opinion, with the scouting report you're getting. And then Cody wants to be out on the map. He wants to play Talia. He wants to play Ahri. He'll even play the Azir. They really want to run through him as their best, most mechanically talented player. And for the most part, that does end up working for them. I think Jose Deodo is a good player. I've talked about him a lot on the channel when he was in the LCS, when we reviewed him every single week. He really has not changed all that much. Going back and watching their playoff run, it really did feel like watching the FlyQuest version of Jose Deodo, which is a good thing. The only concern I really have for Estral that I don't think is overcomable in any way, shape, or form is going to be top lane for me. Zodve is just not good enough. I believe I'm saying that correctly. Again, correct me if the comments if I'm not. Zodve is just okay. He's, in my opinion, the weakest player at this tournament. I didn't really see a ton from him in terms of what I was watching in the LLA playoffs. He was mostly put on weak side, and when he was strong side, he actually wasn't doing all that well, even domestically. And now you're going up against Zeus, who is kind of a noob stomper. That's kind of what he's known for, is taking players that aren't as mechanically talented as him and just burying them in the dirt. He doesn't always have the same level of macro as maybe the other best top laners in the world. He's not going to be 369 where you put him on weak side and he's going to do everything you need him to do. He's going to absolutely obliterate anybody who is worse than him, and unfortunately, I feel like that's going to be a bit of a problem for Estral, and so I imagine that's going to be a lane to watch. But again, support's kind of the matchup that I'm really looking at here. I think mid lane's going to be fun, if only because Cody is a pretty good player. It is Faker, who is obviously better than Cody in every aspect, but, certainly something to watch. But T1 are favorites here for a reason. This series should not be close at all. If this is anything other than a 2-0, T1 is going to walk out of this not feeling particularly good about it. This should be dominant, and it should not be close. So is that what's going to happen? Well, we get to find out, at least starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was T1. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. If they didn't do this, that would have been a disaster. That actually would have been worst case scenario if they had lost the first game of this series. Of course, you believe in this team's ability to be able to bounce back, but this was a chaotic and, quite frankly, not clean game from both of these teams. Estral definitely fighting back in a couple of interesting scenarios and circumstances. A couple of players, I think, actually played pretty well in terms of the mechanics they showed off. Mid-jungle, I think, was pretty strong for Estral, all things considered. Cody, in particular, I think, had a good game on the Ahri, but, I mean, it's just not enough to be able to take down a T1 team, even if T1 is trying their best to lose the game. I mean, there were times where there was really just nothing else to say other than, what the hell are you doing, T1? And they're going to do that every once in a while. People like to pretend that T1 is this super clean, super ridiculously compact macro team that doesn't make mistakes and is going to limit a lot of the errors. That's just not who T1 has ever been in this iteration of 5. Yeah, Faker is that kind of player, and if Faker is your definition of what T1 is, then I guess that makes sense. But Zeus and Owner are like two of the most cocky, aggressive players that you will ever find in the world in terms of the plays that they like to go for. For the most part, it ended up working out here in game number 1, especially Owner, who I think had a pretty underratedly good game outside of that one crazy mistake he made towards the end. But for everyone else, like it was a little bit more back and forth than maybe you would have liked to have seen. Player of the game was very difficult. I don't think anybody on T1 really played perfect in this game. Faker did a lot of really great things, but he also had a couple of bad moments in the middle of that game where it's like, you okay, man? Like, some of those shockwaves were ginormous, and I think it's pretty easy if you want to give him player of the game, but I'm going to give it to Keria, who I thought was kind of the initiator for this team. Nico's support is really good. I continue to really vouch for this pick in draft. I actually think it's stronger than Nico mid right now in the current meta because it doesn't really need the resources that Nico mid does. When you draft Nico in the mid lane, you are sacrificing damage in order to increase your proactivity, and obviously Nico's a very good laner as well, so that's a strength, but Nico doesn't have the same kind of team fight presence that an Orianna or even a Talia would as kind of this setup playmaker. Nico is much more of just an ultimate by the time you hit the late game. That's not nearly as much of an issue in the support position where that kind of is just your role, is to set up for everybody else. And so Keria pulling it out here, not particularly surprising, but I thought he was really good, especially that Baron fight. I think a lot of people are just going to overlook how well he did just kind of 1v4ing outside of the Baron pit. It's not the easiest job in the world to position well like that on Nico, and I know the ultimate did land and everything, and you know, Estral was just clearly looking more towards the Baron than they were trying to capitalize on Keria being out of position, but still, I thought he did a really good job in that particular instance, and he was also the catalyst, I would say, for a lot of their big plays, most notably that top lane dive in the early game. Also worth noting, T1 actually lane swapped for Estral. We're going to see so many lane swaps that I don't even know if it's worth bringing up over the course of this tournament because it's just going to kind of become the norm. Very similar to what it was in like 2015, where I think it was 2015, where that just kind of was the meta. Even like 2013, you go back to 2013, it was super common. I think it's going to be kind of like that at MSI this year just because of the way that the game is developed, but T1 did opt into that lane swap, and you know, Keria, I think, did a lot of work in the top lane during a lot of this game, but he was the most important player. Like I said, Faker also was good. I thought Guma was underratedly very good in this game, was, again, caught out a little bit too much for being far forward early on, or I should say later on in the game, by the time the game was basically out of control, but that's Kalista. That's just generally something that's wrong with the champion and not so much something that's wrong with the player. I still have major questions about Zeus and Owner. This game certainly didn't alleviate all those, but Owner had some fantastic plays. I think when you're looking at the best plays made in this game, Owner probably made like the best plays of anybody on T1. He just also made a lot of bad plays, and I think that didn't give him player of the game for me. And then Zeus is just the greediest top laner you're ever going to see in your entire life. Like, he gets away with so much. Cassante obviously helps with that, but just generally as a player, it's how he has played all year long. Up until this point, it's playing with complete reckless abandon, and, you know, he can get away with it because he is so talented and because he's going into what is, in my opinion, the weakest player at this tournament, but I don't know if that's going to hold up against some of the best teams in the world, and we kind of saw that in the finals. But overall, okay enough from T1. You definitely don't want to see this again in game number 2 because you just want to see them come out and destroy Estral, at least in one of these games. But, you know, for Estral in game 1, some positives to take away. Cody was really good in this game on the Ahri. His mechanics are really solid, and he was really good at being able to capitalize on the over-aggressive mistakes is what I was looking to say here for T1. When Owner would dive too deep, or when Zeus would dive too deep, you know, Cody was there to set up that charm, to set up the rest of his team. Cody's a good player, and it's going to be interesting to see if he continues to be proactive throughout the rest of this series. I also think Ackerman was fine. Jose Deodo had a couple of good plays on the volley bear. They were really aggressive in terms of trying to dive like Faker in the mid game down in the bot lane, and I think a lot of that should be a credit towards them. Looking to make plays, looking to even up gold, even if you're not in like a perfect spot, looking to try and keep things relevant. I think Jose did a good job of that. Ackerman did a good job of that. Snacker just wasn't all that relevant here on the Draven. I get the idea of this pick. You want to try and just take it to T1 early on. You want to try and, you know, pick the Draven, and if you luck yourself into 3 or 4 kills early on in the game, a big cash out for that champion, well then all of a sudden, like, that gold lead might be enough to overcome the talent difference between these two teams. Like, I get the idea behind it, but it's just a pretty risky thing to draft into Gumayushi's Kalista. Like, I'm really not sure that would have been the direction I would have gone in. And Zodva is going to get my dud of the game. Just not a good Yone game. A lot of the mechanics shown here were just not good enough. Like, he was really, really looking to try and fight constantly, and his team just was never in the position to be able to back him up there. There were good plays made by him, but a lot of bad plays on the top side of the map. And so overall, you know, you want to give credit to Estral for keeping themselves in it, for fighting here, but you would have wished that it could have gone a bit different down the back half. But T1 winning game 1 is not a surprise. It is going to be a bit interesting to see if game 2 is more like game number 1 here, because this was a lot closer than I think people wanted it to be. So is game 2 going to be close? Is game 2 going to be T1 returning to form? Is this kind of a prelude to Estral saying like, no, actually we can keep up, shockingly enough? I guess we'll have to find out here in game number 2. Is Estral going to move down to lower bracket, or can they keep this series alive and push us to another game 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game 2. They are going to sweep this series, but by no means was this the dominating, just completely destructive game that you kind of hoped from them. This game was way too close for way too long. At 15 minutes, I think Estral actually had a gold lead in this game, or maybe it was 10 minutes. It was somewhere early on here, and you got to give him a lot of credit, man. Jose Deodo, Ackerman, Snacker, Cody, sometimes they were good this series. This was not a team that didn't show up to play. They showed up to try and beat T1. You can say what you will about the talent discrepancy between these two rosters, between these two teams, but you can't say that Estral didn't give it their best damn effort in this one, because they certainly came out and tried to win this series, but T1 was just too good. You had a couple of players on this team that were simply too strong in this one to be able to overcome. I'm going to give player of the game and player of the series once again to Carrier in the support position. I think a lot of people are going to give it to Owner. And Owner was awesome in the back half of this game. The team fights in particular, he got those Viego resets, he got the quadra kill towards the back half of this game. He was really, really influential, but man, in terms of like keeping pressure on Estral, I think people are just overlooking how good Carrier was in this game. The first 10 to 15 minutes, he was by far the best player on the Rift, and that was with T1 losing elsewhere on the map. And I just need to point that out. Carrier, I think sometimes gets underrated because his flashy games are so flashy that when he's not having these gigantic breakout 2v2 dominant performances on support Caitlyn or whatever, he's just kind of like, people are like, oh, well, he's just kind of playing regular this time. It turns out he plays regular really well. And that being said, is Rumble support regular at this point? Are we willing to say that? Either way, like, Carrier was excellent. He was constantly mid lane. He made Cody's life a complete living hell in the first half of this game. And then the second half, he really took down Zothva. And really, there was nothing else for Estral to do. He single-handedly took away both of the solo laners' ability to play the game in the back half here. So Carrier is player of the game. He's definitely player of the series for me. If you want to give player of the game to Owner here in game 2, I entirely understand. Owner was excellent in the back half of this game. I just really wanted to give a big shout out to Carrier because I do think he was the most valuable player across both of these games, but Owner was excellent. The R5 Viego is something I do want to see more of as this tournament continues to progress. Something we've really gotten away from is carry junglers. It's really not like meta to pick a carry jungler right now, as some of the comments on my meta video would point out. I don't think that carry junglers are necessarily awful. I just think you're lowering your consistency by going a carry jungler. Like Maokai said, you're just so consistent on a game-to-game basis. If they're not available, I still think Viego's really, really good and actually does offer quite a bit in terms of skirmishing in the early game. He's no Xin Zhao, he's no Lee Sin, but he can do things in the early game. He's not just a complete useless champion like something like, I don't know, a Nocturne would be pre-6. He can still do a lot, so I like Viego, and Owner was excellent in this game. He was pretty good in this series overall. I think game 1 he had, you know, really one or two moments where I was looking at it like, what are you doing? But for the most part, he was really excellent in game 2. Faker doesn't really make mistakes. His Orianna is super clean. I think Guma was better than people are going to give him credit for a lot of this series. And Zeus was also good in this game. You know, he got solo killed, which was definitely not an ideal situation. Sometimes he's just going to push himself too far forward, get stuck under tower, and take an extra shot and die for no reason. But, I mean, Zothva was not able to play the game, and that was entirely due to Zeus just, like, punishing every single mistake that he made on the Aatrox. He was able to survive for a little bit, like the first 15 minutes of the game. It's like, wow, they're putting a lot of pressure into this Aatrox, but are they getting enough out of it in order to justify it, or are they just taking away the Aatrox from the side of Estral? Well, no, eventually they started getting to him, and it became a real problem. We'll get to that a bit later, but Zeus did a great job of taking away top lane, even if I think some of his individual plays weren't as ideal as you would like. I'm still a bit concerned about Zeus, and this series didn't really do anything to completely change my mind on that. But Owner and Carrier were definitely the standouts for me. Faker obviously is very good, very consistent. Guma was better here than I think he's going to get credit for. I just don't think T1 as a unit was nearly as on the money as they usually are. This more so felt like a T1 game in the LCK, where it's like pretty even for 20 minutes, T1 wins a fight and the game is over. That's more of what it felt like, although it wasn't quite that game state. It was more so just taking things away from the Aatrox over and over, and the Ahri as well. Cody had a rough one here, but For Estral, getting into them now, it sucks for them to lose this, but I mean, they played their hearts out in this series. Truly, there's nothing to walk away from in a negative light here. If you are Estral Esports, if you're the LLA, you tried your best in this one, and I think you had a couple of positives. Jose Deodo was excellent here in Game 2 on the Lee Sim, really showing his mastery over that champion that he's had the entirety of his career. There were moments where he was outplaying Owner in some of these fights. He just didn't have the same kind of resources around him or didn't have the same kind of ability to win fights on that champion as Owner would on Viego. Snacker and Ackerman, I thought, were also relatively fine in this game. Snacker could have been a bit more aggressive on the Draven. He got the cash out. I really wanted to see them play for bot lane a bit more, but they didn't want to do that. Ackerman, same thing. The arrows were often going wide, and I think that was a bit of a problem, but generally he wasn't mispositioning, which I think is all you can really ask for out of an LLA team. It was the solo laners that were getting picked on. Cody is a very good player, but man, T1 knew that, and T1 invested every resource they had in the mid game into taking this Ahri out of the game, and it was the right decision because they didn't really have anybody else on this team that's going to be able to recoup that pressure. And then Zothva is going to get dead of the game again. Just not a good game. It's hard to say because honestly, through the first like 10 to 15 minutes, like I said, it was like, he's doing an okay job of absorbing pressure. He's down like 4 levels and 70 CS, but at the very least, he's not giving over kills, right? But eventually the kills started rolling in and now you're down 4 levels and 100 CS and you have 9 deaths. And it's like, okay, well, things just are not going your way in the top lane. He definitely was a weakness for Estral. We identified that going into the tournament and that kind of played out in this first matchup. But again, there's really just not a lot to be upset by if you're an Estral Esports fan. This was generally a good series for them, all things considered. Maybe it wasn't perfect, maybe you could improve on things, but their series against PSG is certainly going to be a lot more interesting than I think I expected going into the tournament. But for T1, I just want to see this team actually just dominate someone. Like, it just has been so long since T1 clearly felt like the better team. Even when they played Hanwha Life, like, it didn't really feel like they were definitely the better team, especially because they lost to them in a sweep in the previous series that they played against them. It just hasn't felt very good watching T1 recently. They make too many micro mistakes. They're good enough to be able to recover, and their like 20 to 28 minutes is like the best in the world. It's what they do, but you got to fix every other part of the game too. So yes, T1 is moving on, but there still really is a lot that I want to see improve on this team. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Play-Ins Day 1 overview and analysis video. Of course, up on the screen, the play-in bracket. T1 and FlyQuest moving on to the winners finals of Group A. The winner of that will qualify out of Group A as the #1 seed, if you will. Estral and PSG Talon will play against each other in the lower bracket to see who gets an opportunity to get the loser of the winners finals, the lower bracket finals, whatever you want to call it, however you want to justify it. You guys know what the format is. But Group B is going to be tomorrow. Round 1 of Group B will be day #2. That's Top Esports versus Loud, which should be a fun one. 2 very aggressive teams that I imagine will be very bloody. And then Fnatic versus GAM. You really have no idea what you're going to get out of GAM, and honestly, you kind of don't know what you're going to get out of Fnatic either. And so both of those series should be fun. I'm excited. I'd love to know you guys' thoughts on all the games today and both of the series tomorrow down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're covering every single day of MSI on this channel. Of course, we'll be covering all of the major regions as soon as they come back in the summer split as well. So if you're interested in LoL Esports overviews, analysis, player reviews, all that kind of stuff, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.